I lead the Energy Consortium at IIT Madras, which is a broad initiative to enable development of technologies for this low carbon transition. So there's a lot of technology that is being developed, but a lot that is also not being developed or in very early stages that is required for commercialization and for this transition to happen in a very smooth way. As a part of our effort towards disseminating the work that we do, we have the Kotak IITM Save Energy Mission, which is a broad initiative spread across multiple institutions. I'll talk a little bit about where we work with MSMEs particularly to help promote energy efficiency and carbon mitigation assessment. I did work quite a bit in the industry before transitioning to academics. Before I move on to the topic, I just want to give this in context as to how and what we are trying to build at IIT Madras towards enabling sustainability in our energy systems and also broadly sustainability in our resource consumption. So this is our School of Sustainability, where currently we are sitting in a seminar hall that belongs to IGCS. But you can imagine we can look at our environment in three fronts: the built environment, the natural environment, and the digital environment. Most of energy and decarbonization that we talk about focuses thoroughly on the built environment, but there is almost always a continuous nexus between these two. That's how we now start looking at these two as a continuum. So we are looking at interlinking both, or looking at projects that will touch upon. One such initiative that we have recently started is our work with Coimbatore, the Green Coimbatore initiative, to look at reimagining a Coimbatore market where all of the multiple facets of the market works in an integrated way, so that you have zero waste, net zero energy, and sustainable consumption of the produce that come into the market. Of course, the Robert Bosch Center works along with us in many of these projects, because now data has become very, very critical in taking many of these decisions. Energy Consortium itself was set up with multiple research initiatives, which included core technology elements that you see on your right side, elements that are being developed to help with multiple hard-to-abate sectors, but also on the interventions and implementation. So Professor Krishna is here. We work together on looking at microgrids and reimagining microgrids, because the way we are looking at expansion of renewable into our energy mix, it does not make sense to have large centralized power generation stations, but it has to be more community driven. So that's a project that we are looking on. In all of this, the other one that we are looking on is a building like IIT Madras or IIT Madras Research Park, which has a 70 megawatt hour consumption because of the usage that is there in the center. How can we go 100% renewable? If you really want to demonstrate, we have to test it. So here, they're already at about 80% renewable, where there's a megawatt of rooftop power supply, but then 2 megawatt of solar and 2 megawatt of wind that is being wheeled in. Rest is being procured from TNEB. Now we are pushing it forward to say, if we want to make it even more sustainable, how do we implement energy storage on the premises? So currently in the process of commissioning a 2.5 megawatt hour energy storage for short term, because most of the renewables on the grid now is becoming, the settlement time of the wheeled in power is becoming 15 minutes. Right now it's about a month, but there is plans to get it to 15 minutes, which makes sense because we generate and we need to store our own power. So that's where we are looking at. The energy modeling group that we have set up, particularly to look at overall the risk and the emerging scenarios. How do we imagine each of the sector to evolve? If you say cement, or if you say steel, or if you say any of those sectors, looking at the way it is currently being run and what are the likely pathways that each of the sector will take. And also an important element here is there are many studies that talk about individual sectors generically, but if you put it in context, in India, given there are so many sectors of priority, which sector should do what first and what sequence is something that we are looking at, and that's where our current focus on developing decarbonization modeling tools come in. Overall, the consortium itself has these 7 centers of excellence. We now have 9, we have added one more, we have 10 industry members. Essentially, they are core partners because finally technology needs to be translated, needs to be adopted. So that's why we are working very closely with them. Extensive collaboration with multiple research centers across the country and also outside of India. We do have our energy summit that happens every December. And we have the Climafix, which is more of a startup equivalent of the energy summit, looking at the players in the ecosystem who is trying to commercialize technology. We are a member of the COP forum. So our first COP summit was COP 28, which means we are an observer member. So we do have our, this time we mostly only observed. So but going forward, we do intend to participate in a much more meaningful way. Our general vision, as you know, really help to reduce GHG, but also through partnerships. The other thing that we also are very keen on is developing these sandboxes, because technology de-risking needs to happen, and it needs to happen in India for the community here to benefit, and also try to cash in, or I would say try to generate internal companies that are capable of addressing this solution. Of course, these are some of our industry members. Now, why is this extremely important? This is extremely important because this kind of gives you an idea on where we are, right? This is a report that was developed by McKinsey, but it kind of gives you what do we need to focus on. When we say hard to abate, some of them are hard to abate because you cannot live without them, and you need power. I mean, all said and done, the earlier session said, why should some other community pay for the sins of some other community? But all said and done, we need power. So that's where we are. The reality is our grid emission intensity right now is about 790 grams of CO2 per unit of power generated. If you want that to go down, this needs to go down. And getting this down is quite difficult. And then the rest of it, these are all infrastructural sectors. If you really look at it, the others is where all our MSMEs and all of that play a role. But they indirectly play a role through the consumption of power. But all of these are other sectors that contribute directly to our carbon emissions. And then the third sector, of course, agriculture, dairy and others. These are because of practices, essentially about management of methane. And so this is GHG emissions, equivalent of CO2. And many of these agricultural sectors, the issues are with not necessarily CO2, but other gases like methane and NO2 and a few other elements that contribute. We are focused on transportation, but in the overall scheme of things, it's about 9%, which is still not too small, but I think it'll be there soon, and the rest of it as it is seen here. Now, the elephant in the room are these sectors that we want to address, and these need to be addressed fast enough to make any kind of a difference. Now, the question that we are asking is, you probably heard about hydrogen. You probably heard about carbon capture. You probably heard about offsets. Offsets really contribute to nothing. It's really, really small. So it really doesn't make any kind of meaningful contribution in our effort. So we need to address the problem in the source. If we need to do that, are we ready? Now, you probably heard about a few of these areas, but the big challenge is, you can imagine the kind of timeline that is required for this entire effort to be completed. And you really look at, if you say, I want to unlock the decarbonization potential of an industry, look at hard to abate sector and then general process and manufacturing sector. You need to have almost all of these functioning and commercially viable to actually make an impact. So without which we are only talking about the first few things, right? Electrification and energy efficiency, which we do anyway. And we are progressing very well. And for electrification to be completely done well, you need long duration energy storage. Because if you say, I want to kick off that big black box in coal, you need this to be available. And this is not yet commercially mature. You don't have any meaningful long duration energy storage. At best, you can do about 72 hours of storage. That's all you have. And even that is very expensive. That almost always doubles your energy price. So what are the technologies that are available for us, and what are the technologies that are available so that you are not dependent on critical minerals? That's the next question, right? You can always talk about solutions, but then if you start depending on critical minerals for that, then how do you address? Similarly, hydrogen is something that we are talking about a lot. Green hydrogen, and we are talking about 5 million tons and all of that. But where do you use it? If you want to use it for industrial applications, we don't have technologies that support that. For example, furnaces and boilers, it's not yet mature. Similarly, we look at hydrogen for other kinds of applications where you almost think of it will replace the liquid fossil fuel that is being used right now. Then you don't have transportation facilities. Hydrogen is not something that's easy to transport, not even easy to store. So the current utilization of hydrogen is very likely to be you produce and you consume. The sectors that are likely to use them are refineries, because refineries use hydrogen in large quantities. The next sector that's likely to use it is fertilizers. But beyond that, where do you use it? Similarly, you are looking at these are all CO2 capture is something people have demonstrated very well, and now people are saying commercially we will do it. But if you look at the overall CO2 emission, that's going to be a drop in the ocean. And the second question normally you start asking is, after I capture, what do I do? You can probably send it for some beverage industry where CO2 is required, but that's a very, very small fraction. The thing that is not yet done is the other thing, right? Conversion, utilization and sequestration. So when you do not have all of these technology elements lined up, now these are the kind of gaps that you generate, which without addressing which the overall potential for decarbonization kind of remains minimal. One of the opportunity and solution is say that I will not focus on any of these, I will look at batteries and I will look at RE. That's one way to do, but still the way you look at the other sectors, right, the CO2, the cement and the steel sector, even when you do 100% RE, they are still likely to produce a lot of process CO2 emissions, because steel making requires coke, and there is a process emission from calcination of the CaCO3 that produces lime for cement. So there are process emissions that are associated, and similarly you look at every segment of decarbonization. I have broadly broken it down into 4 segments: industry, agriculture, transportation and habitation. Everywhere there are technologies that are required for deep decarbonization, which I think as a society we are talking about a few things, but there are real big gaps in terms of maturing technology fast enough. So these are, in my opinion, of course this is something that I put up, it's in my opinion some of the critical technology elements that we need to address, and we need to address this in a holistic way. Now I will tell you about what we are doing at IIT Madras. We have set ourselves, as I said, the energy consortium, and we are working in these, organized ourselves in 6 hubs. 6 hubs naturally form, going back to my earlier slide, in terms of hydrogen, carbon, CCUS, energy efficiency, resiliency of energy systems, which is very important given the nature of the disruptions that are happening because of the once in, I don't know, a year event right now. RE, how do we integrate more RE into the grid, and energy storage. And in each of these are some of the activities we call as research thrusts. So what we are trying to address right now is to say, in each of those areas that we see as gap or element that needs to be developed, can we identify opportunities to seed the basic research and seed the partnership that is required for us to accelerate. So imagine this, right? Imagine we all talk about UPI, you all talk about these seamless digital payments, but if you imagine what was required to unlock that digital payment, you had the early 2000s, you already have internet banking or the web enabled or mobile, not mobile, computerization of banking. And then you had the mechanisms for settlement, you had the RTGS, NEFTs and all of that came about. Then you also had the IMPS settlement system that came about. So what was then missing were the interfaces. So similarly, what I see a role in decarbonization is, right now we have technology elements coming up in multiple places. What we do not have right now is these interfaces that are required for each of the technology elements to communicate and work in a single fashion. If a cement plant says, I want to go carbon neutral, there is no way they can go carbon neutral. I mean, it can be on paper and it will be a 15-year, 20-year roadmap. Now, and even that will be dependent on something becoming mature by 2035. And this is the same with all sectors. It's the same with all sectors. Even take our own EV sector. And not just in India, in the US right now, you probably heard Enterprise, the rent-a-car company, which went all electric or with a big fleet of electric in 2021, now has kind of decided to go back to gasoline fleets. The whole thing is that the network infrastructure has not did not catch up fast enough for the rollout that they had planned. So these are critical gaps. No? When you say, what do we understand by the gaps that are there, these are elements that are playing out. So this is the consortium that we are trying to build, and this is something that we would like to start working with multiple of our partners, including other IITs and CSIR labs, to see how do we fill out what is required for us to accelerate our net zero transition. And the guiding principle with which we work, right? So this is generally the overall hierarchy of net zero. So if you really look at it, what do I need to do first? And most often we say you use the available resources better. That's the principle of circularity, that's the principle of efficiency. So that's the center that we have set up, the industrial energy assessment cell. the overarching objective is to improve energy utilization, because if you minimize your energy use, you don't need all of those extra systems that you need to, extra units that you need to produce. In that, many of it is, you probably read my bio, most of the work I do is on cooling and heating systems, try to improve the efficiency and as much as possible recycle and reuse the waste heat. Now the next big block that we need to address is improve our renewable energy utilization, which really talks about multiple things. One is, of course, long duration energy storage. That's a slightly long-term game, but even before that is energy demand management, because there is so many flexible loads that are available for us to play with. Right now, not everybody needs to run every load at the same time. Though we almost always assume it has to be done in a linear fashion, if you have smart ways of managing demand, even domestic demand, there are multiple ways by which you can do. And linked with that is the thermal energy, because you imagine the India's grid, upcoming grid, more than 50% of energy usage of the peak grid is going to go towards cooling. And if it's really going to go towards cooling, it makes a lot of sense to understand how do you handle the cooling so that it becomes a battery. It's a fairly cost-effective battery rather than going for many of the other technologies that require much more efforts. And microgrids is some of our favorite topics because it gives that flexibility to your grid. So that's something that we are really looking to see, how do we do. The last aspect of it is the most expensive and most talked about aspect, which includes alternative fuels, carbon capture, supplying green ammonia and all of that, and carbon offsets. This is one of the most, I would say, contentious items. So I really think if you just leave nature to itself, we'll take care of it. We really focus only on technology. I mean, plantations and all of that, it's something that you really don't know how it works. So you better leave nature to itself, don't destroy mangroves, whatever it is. That takes care of itself. So we don't worry about that. All right? So that kind of gives you a context. So now this is our center. As I said, we really work. So it's not that we work sitting inside IIT, sitting inside classrooms. We have these extensive outreach centers across the country to go out and work with these MSMEs, really work with these manufacturing units to say how they can become competitive. And the first step in becoming competitive is knowing what you consume. Many times we find that they don't even have a proper measure on what they consume. So that's where it starts. And then, of course, now we have this very, I would say, strong network, excellent set of people across the country who works and starts providing us primary data to allow us with the interventions. Now, just to give you a context, right, we talked about all of these technologies. Now, it may appear like, okay, it's going to take a long time to mature, but that's not the case, you know. In many of these cases, we have it reasonably mature. Now, what it really means is that it really requires us to understand what we need to do in a more systematic way and accelerate or scale it up. So, everything I talked about, right, long duration energy storage, the power electronics required for microgrids and management of these, looking at simple Narmada River Canal kind of projects where you say the water is running, can you generate some 50 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt power out of it? You do have these kinetic turbines, wasted steam, municipal solid waste. So, every single way you can imagine how an energy system can be. We do have technologies, and this is only from IIT. I mean, if you go to all of the CSIR labs, you will probably have 10 times as much technology that is being available. So, it's not a question of lack of technology, but it's rather a question of lack of holistic approach to this whole problem. So one of the way, I mean, we have gone, this is the last one that I said, because people really talk about carbon capture without really having a baseline reference of what it really means. What it really means in terms of its environmental footprint, what it really means in terms of its cost, life cycle, recyclability, whole bunch of parameters. So we have developed this carbon capture demonstrator, which is outside, if you walk out, it's right near our Center for Innovation building. The whole objective is for industries and other people who want to understand this whole activity to test it out and get a first-hand feel for the numbers. And that's the second challenge, right? First-hand feel for the numbers is something that we really want to work on. So one other thing that we really want to understand is the decarbonization modeling that I talk about. Now, we really talk about every element in a unitary fashion or silofied fashion. When I say carbon capture, I say this is one technology. When I say energy efficiency, it's one technology. But it doesn't work that way in what I call as in the real life. And if you want to implement it, I want to understand it in a complete sectoral way. So this is one thing that we are trying to work very hard to develop, with the intention that now if there is a sustainability report that is produced by a company, which is now mandated to report through BRSR and others, I can take the data and go back and say how that industry is performing. What is their emission intensity? What is their plant efficiency? And now this goes back to tell me how are they achieving it, if they are so good or if they are so bad. And if these numbers, what kind of interventions are they doing? And then finally, if they want to go from say 0.6 to 0.2, what do they need to do? So this, as I said, this is with one sector. Similarly, we have developed this tool as such is something that we are developing it for an open source. So anybody who can do basically a flow sheeting can work with the tool, input the data and start building these models. And as you build these models, now I can start asking questions like, if I have 5 million tons of hydrogen, should I give it to steel or cement or refinery? Where would it make most sense? If I say my target is 45% emission reduction by 2030, which is one of our Panchamrit goals, how do I do that? If I have these resources and this much capital, how do I allocate it? So some of the questions we want to answer is something that we are currently working on, and I think the emerging thing that we also are trying to do as we do that is this whole reporting of ESG. What we find it is a bit confusing and bit all over the place. So we are trying to say, for an MSME, if a company wants to really do something, how do we map it? So we are trying to map it in terms of parameters, which is a simple Likert kind of a scale. And when we do an assessment, energy we already measure. Most of the S&G parameters are survey based, meaning it's all qualitative input. So how do we capture those numbers so that we can start comprehensively understanding how our industries are working and how we can help them. So that's the tool that we are developing. I will stop here and thank you for the time, and this is a wonderful area. Happy to collaborate with anybody who's interested.